Asterisk, asterisk, what would you do if, after an important job interview, you came home to find the locks changed, all your belongings trapped inside, and the only message from your mother was backslash, backslash, we've changed the locks. You don't live here anymore, backslash, backslash? Asterisk, asterisk, how would you react when the very people who raised you, who claimed to love you unconditionally, were the ones who threw you out at your weakest moment? I used to think I knew what disappointment felt like, what pressure felt like, what loneliness felt like. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the moment I stood in front of the door I once called home, holding a useless key and carrying a pain too deep for words. Have you ever felt like your entire life was a play, and you were just a side character in a story someone else wrote? As I sat in my car, parked on the driveway, hands trembling as I dialed again, and again with no one picking up, I didn't just lose a place to stay. I lost trust. I lost a sense of safety. I lost whatever pieces were left of a family that had been cracked for years. But the one thing I never expected, the one thing that still gives me chills, is that the only person who stayed by my side was someone who had already passed away 3 years earlier. My grandmother. The woman I thought had only left behind memories had, in truth, left behind a plan. A quiet, powerful plan to protect me from my own blood. You believe family is where you go when everything falls apart? But what if family is the very thing that breaks you? What would you do to rise again? This isn't just my story. It might be yours too. And it all began with a locked door and a letter from the past, backslash. Have you ever felt like there's no place in the world where you truly belong? Not because you chose to leave, but because the people who were supposed to love you most decided to erase you from their lives. I stood in front of the door that had been my home for 18 years, and for the past 6 months, the only place I clung to for even a flicker of warmth. And in that moment I knew there was no going back. But the truth is, it didn't start with that locked door. It started years ago, in the heavy silences at dinner, in my father's disappointed stares, in the way my mother always told me I wasn't living the way a daughter should. You know what hurts more than silence? It's realizing that the people who gave you life only accept you if you follow the script they wrote for you. Since I was a child, I was forced into perfect molds. Achievements, reputation, applause from strangers. Those were my parents' obsessions. And when I no longer fit their vision of success, I stopped being their daughter. I became a burden, a disappointment, a walking reminder of their failure. I'll never forget the time I was 15 and got an A in chemistry. My father didn't say a word during dinner. He just placed the paper on the table, circled in red, and said, "If you can't be excellent, you don't deserve the Anderson name." Back then, I thought he was being tough because he cared. But today, reading that message saying I no longer had a home, I finally understood. Their love was never unconditional. You know what stings the most? It's realizing that in your weakest moment, when all you need is someone to hold you, that embrace never existed for you. And what hurts even more is when a stranger shows more concern than your own family. An elderly neighbor rushed over to ask if I was okay, while my mother stood in the kitchen, watching me through the window, and never once opened the door. I'm not sharing this for pity. I'm sharing it because somewhere out there, someone else might be feeling just as abandoned by their own blood. And if you're listening, I want you to know this. You are not alone. This story isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. And there are truths buried in the past that will change everything forever. Backslash, just when I thought I had lost everything, a message from the past came back, quiet, but more powerful than anything I had ever known. It wasn't a comforting text. It wasn't an apology from my parents. And it definitely wasn't a door magically opening again. It was an email from a law office with a subject line that seemed to have nothing to do with the mess I was in. A trust fund in the name of my late grandmother, Beverly Monroe, the only person who ever told me, "Carly, you don't have to be like anyone else in this family. You just have to be you." When I was little, she was the only one who didn't force me to play piano when I hated it, who didn't sign me up for science camp when all I wanted was to write. She was the rare light in the suffocating control of my parents. And it turns out that light never went out. She had prepared everything before she passed, as if she knew one day I'd be pushed out, as if she understood that at some point I'd need something stronger than the conditional love I was taught to settle for. I didn't fully understand the email at first, but one phrase froze me in place: breach of residential terms stated in the trust. A lawyer named Jonathan Pierce was requesting an urgent meeting to discuss my rights related to the property and my living situation. In that moment, I knew something big had been kept from me. Maybe the house I was just thrown out of wasn't entirely my parents' to begin with. Maybe my grandmother had left more than kind words in handwritten letters. Maybe I wasn't just some failure begging for a place to stay. Maybe I was the rightful heir to a truth that could flip the entire game. And from that moment on, the story changed. I was no longer the girl standing in front of a locked door. I was getting ready to walk through another door, one of truth, power, and justice. A door my grandmother had left behind, meant only for me, at the exact moment I would need it most. And if you think the story ends here, you haven't heard the best part yet. The next morning, I arrived at the law office on time, hands shaking with nerves, but heart filled with resolve. 100 thoughts spun through my mind. Did my grandmother really leave something for me? Had she seen all of this coming? The answer came faster than I ever expected. Jonathan Pierce, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes softened by a quiet kindness, opened a thick file and said the words that took the air right out of my lungs. Carly, the house you were kicked out of it actually belongs to a trust established by your grandmother. And the only condition allowing your parents to live there was that you must always retain the right to return, anytime you needed. I froze. In a single instant, everything shattered and flooded me at once. I hadn't just been emotionally betrayed. My legal rights had been violated. My parents had no authority to change the locks. They had broken a clearly stated condition in a legal document created by my grandmother to protect me. What she did was a revenge. It was the most silent, powerful form of love I'd ever known. I sat there, listening as every detail unfolded. The education fund my parents had misused to renovate the kitchen, the college money that was meant for me, quietly siphoned off for 3 years without my knowledge. Every line in that file was another knife cutting into an old wound, but also undeniable proof. Jonathan looked me in the eyes and said, "You have the right to reclaim residency immediately. Or you can file suit to remove your parents from their role as trustees." This was the turning point. I was no longer the daughter shoved out into the street. I was someone who held the law, the evidence, the truth. And more importantly, I held my voice, the one I had lost for nearly 3 decades. I didn't respond right away. But deep down, I knew this was no longer just about me. This was the moment I stood up, not only for myself, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel worthless by the very people who were supposed to love them. I walked out of the law office with my mind spinning, but in my heart, there was something I hadn't felt in years: strength. Not the hollow kind that comes from empty encouragement, but a strength born from truth, from justice, from finally knowing who I was in this story. I wasn't the failure. I wasn't the burden. I was the one who had been trusted, prepared, and protected by someone who saw in me what I hadn't yet seen in myself. My grandmother, the woman with silver hair and sharp, knowing eyes, turned out not to be just a quiet supporter. She was the strategist of unconditional love. While the world had taught me to please others to be accepted, she was the only one who ever taught me that being yourself was the real goal. And now, standing at the crossroads, one path to walk away quietly, the other to rise and reclaim what was mine, I no longer hesitated. I would reclaim it, not for money, not for the house, but because I needed to end the years of being controlled, defined by expectations and conditions. I needed to stand up, not just for the woman I am today, but for the little girl I once was who had no choice but to silently endure. Back at my best friend's tiny apartment, I opened my laptop and reread every line of the file. At the very end, I found a scanned handwritten letter, the slanted, familiar script I knew by heart. A letter from my grandmother, written before she passed. It said, "Carly, if you're reading this, it means things have reached their limit. And if that's the case, then now is the time to stand up. And remember, you are not alone. I have always believed in you." I read that letter over and over. Each word felt like a brick rebuilding the trust one thought had been shattered for good. And I knew tomorrow I would act, not with rage, but with the calm of someone who finally understood her worth. Because this time, I wasn't just carrying pain. I was carrying the legacy of a love that asked for nothing in return. I spent that entire evening handwriting a detailed account of everything that had happened, from the moment I returned home to the moment I was thrown out. Every event, every word, every message. There was no doubt left. Every action my parents took was a clear violation of the terms my grandmother had painstakingly laid out. And each of those actions was also a rejection, not just of me as their daughter, but of me as a human being. The next day, I sat down with Jonathan to draft the official notice demanding the restoration of my residency and the initiation of a financial investigation. As I signed the documents, I felt like I was closing a chapter of my life, the chapter of endurance, of constantly shrinking myself to make others comfortable. I no longer needed their approval to exist. I had the law, I had the truth, and I had a grandmother who had quietly handed me the key to freedom. Jonathan looked at me, his voice calm but firm, and told me that cases like this often come with deep emotional pain. But I simply nodded, because the deepest pain I had ever known didn't come from a courtroom. It came from the moment I stood in front of my own home holding a key that no longer worked. Every step I've taken since has been about reclaiming something my parents never taught me, belief in myself. Just a few hours after the notice reached them, I got the first phone call from my parents in weeks. It wasn't an apology. It was anger, denial, and the same old manipulation they'd always used. But this time, I didn't respond with fear. I hung up. I sent the entire call recording to my lawyer. Then I sat quietly in that tiny room, watching sunlight pour through the window, and for the first time, I didn't feel lost. I was no longer someone begging to be allowed in. I was someone choosing her own path. And this was only the beginning. This story isn't just about being kicked out of a house. It's about how a young woman reclaimed a voice that had been stolen from her for a lifetime. And now that she's speaking, no one's ever going to silence her again. / 2 days later, my parents' attorney, an older man, my father's longtime golf buddy, responded. The tone of the email was familiar. Denial, minimization, deflection. They claimed changing the locks was just a temporary measure after a disagreement, that I was being too sensitive, and that the withdrawal of the education fund was only due to necessary home repairs. Not a single admission of fault. Not a shred of accountability. Not even a whisper of an apology. But unlike before, I wasn't shaken. This time, I had proof. Jonathan responded firmly. Their actions didn't just breach the terms of the trust, they showed signs of financial abuse. A preliminary audit revealed over $120,000 had been withdrawn from my education fund, with no trace of that money ever going towards school expenses. While I was working night shifts at a coffee shop, scraping by to pay off student loans, they used that money to remodel the kitchen with marble countertops and book a luxury European cruise. And then Trevor, my younger brother, called. His voice was quiet, hesitant. He said our parents were falling apart because I was blowing things out of proportion. I laughed. After a decade of living under their control, now that I was standing up for myself, I was the one being called the troublemaker. I asked Trevor one question. Did you know about the scholarship fund? After a pause, he said yes. He knew, but he thought they had told me. I wasn't angry at Trevor. I was just sad. He had been raised to obey, to comply, to maintain peace at all costs, even if it meant suppressing the truth. But I couldn't do that. I wouldn't pretend not to see what was right in front of me just to keep things looking calm. Peace bought with silence wasn't peace at all, not anymore. That night, I sat down and wrote a formal proposal to Jonathan. I didn't want to destroy my family, but I also wasn't going to excuse abuse wrapped in the language of love. I proposed ownership of a modest apartment funded by the remaining trust, full financial independence, and a requirement that my parents attend 1 year of family therapy with a licensed professional. If they refused, I would pursue full legal action to have them removed as trustees. I wasn't doing this out of hate. I was doing it for justice. For my grandmother, the woman who taught me that real love never comes with threats or conditions. My story was no longer about fighting for a house. It had become a journey to reclaim myself. And I knew, without a doubt, I wasn't backing down. / 2 days later, the exact deadline set by my lawyer, the official response from my parents arrived. They are accepted. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, but also no resistance. The agreement was signed, including every condition I had outlined. A new apartment would be purchased in my name, full access to the education fund would be restored, and an independent financial monitor would oversee all trust activity moving forward. Most importantly, my parents were required to participate in 1 year of family therapy with a court-appointed third-party professional. When I received the signed documents, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant or elated, just relieved. As if the years of heaviness slowly melted from my chest, making space for something new. A kind of peace I had never known. Not because I had one, but because I no longer needed anyone's permission to simply be myself. The following weekend, I returned to the old house to collect my things. Not as the daughter who had been kicked out, but as someone legally recognized to have rightful access to that home. Trevor came with me to keep the atmosphere neutral. My mother stayed silent the entire time. She looked at me, then lowered her head, saying nothing. My father avoided the scene entirely. My old room was just as I'd left it, except colder, as if the house itself could feel the fracture that could never be repaired. I packed what mattered: personal documents, my old laptop, a few books my grandmother had given me. As I was about to leave, Trevor reached out, gently held my hand and whispered, "You did something no one in this family ever dared to do. I don't know if I'll ever be as brave as you, but I'm proud to have you as my sister." I didn't speak. I just nodded and hugged him, because deep down I knew this wasn't just about reclaiming my rights. It was about opening a door for the next generation to escape the cycle of conditional love this family had been trapped in for decades. When I stepped out of that house for the last time, I didn't look back, because this time, I wasn't running away. I was walking forward, into a new chapter. One of freedom, of truth, and of a woman who had learned how to rise from her pain and turn it into power. / my new apartment is in Maplewood, quiet, full of trees, where morning sunlight pours through the glass windows like a gentle greeting. Every time I wake up, I no longer feel the fear of being watched. No more knocks at dinner time like commands. No one demanding that I live as some version of myself they wanted. This is my space, a life I choose for myself. I placed a photo of Grandma Beverly on the bookshelf by the window. She's wearing a beige sweater, her silver hair neatly tied back, hands resting on an old book. Her eyes look toward the camera, but I've always felt like she was looking right at me. Every time I feel lost, I look at that photo. And I remember what she told me when I was 14. Never let anyone define you, not even family. I've started applying for the master's program in digital marketing, the one I had dreamed of for years. This time, no one is objecting. No one is controlling. I'm using the very trust fund that should have always been mine. And to study for my own growth, instead of for someone else's approval, it feels completely different. At the same time, I've begun attending individual therapy sessions. Dr. Rivera, a seasoned psychologist, told me that betrayal from family doesn't always require immediate forgiveness. It requires understanding. Understanding why you were hurt. Understanding that the pain doesn't define your worth. Slowly, I'm learning to silence those inner voices that kept telling me I wasn't enough, that I didn't deserve more. At the end of each session, I walk through the park near my apartment, where there's an empty wooden bench I like to sit on and read. I'm not the same person anymore. I'm Carly, a woman who lost everything, but found herself in the process. And if someone asked me whether I've forgiven my parents, my answer would be, I'm learning to forgive, but I'll never forget. Because it's those very memories that remind me never to go back to who I used to be. / 2 months after I officially moved into my new apartment, my life began to take clearer shape. Every morning, I woke up on time, not because anyone told me to, but because I wanted to own my day. I spent time studying the foundational courses for my master's program, while also picking up small freelance projects in content and media strategy. The income wasn't much, but the feeling of working without needing permission or approval from anyone was a kind of freedom I had never known. During a group therapy session on family dysfunction, I shared my story with strangers for the first time. No hiding, no avoidance. I spoke about how my parents used to control every detail of my life, how they wrapped their love in chains of expectations, and how they eventually kicked me out like I never belonged. When I finished, a woman in the group started crying. She said I had just spoken the words she had never dared to admit in over 30 years. In that moment, I realized my story wasn't just mine. It was a voice for everyone who had ever been smothered under the disguise of familial love. I continued attending the court-mandated family therapy sessions. My father usually just sat silently, offering only an occasional nod. My mother cried a lot in the beginning, then shifted to anger, then exhaustion, then quiet. In the 6th week, she said something I'll never forget. Maybe I loved you the wrong way, but I never wanted you to become a stranger. I didn't respond right away, because the distance between us wasn't something I created. It came from the years they never tried to see who I truly was. I don't expect miracles from therapy. I know some gaps can never be bridged. But for the first time, we were forced to look at each other, really look. And for me, that was enough to call it a beginning. Not of reconciliation, but of understanding. And from that place, I can keep walking forward, without ever needing to look back, One Sunday morning, as I was prepping a presentation for my digital content strategy class, my phone rang. The screen lit up with Trevor's name. I hesitated for a few seconds before answering. My brother, the one who'd always lived between two worlds. On one side, expectation and obedience. On the other, me. The smudge on our family's perfect portrait. Trevor said he wanted to meet. Not at our parents' house, not at the lawyer's office, but at a small cafe near the park where I often take my walks. When I arrived, he was already there with 2 lattes, still the considerate type, still careful to avoid confrontation. I sat down and waited in silence. And then Trevor said something I hadn't dared to hope for in years. "I'm sorry." He admitted that all along, he had seen how I was treated, but didn't have the courage to speak up. Because he was afraid of being seen as disloyal, afraid of losing the approval he had grown used to. "I know you've always been the strong one," he said, "but sometimes I forgot that being strong doesn't mean you don't get hurt." That apology didn't erase what had happened, but it felt like the first crack of light breaking through the fogged glass my family had lived behind for so long. I didn't need my brother to take my side forever. I just needed him to acknowledge that I hadn't imagined it, that I wasn't being dramatic, and that I was never the one who ruined everything. We sat a while longer, talking about school, work, and about Grandma, the woman who had quietly protected me until her last breath. Trevor said he never knew she'd set up such a complex trust, but now he understood why. She knew you'd be the first to stand up to everything. I left that cafe feeling lighter, not because my family had changed, but because I had. I was no longer the abandoned child begging for acceptance. I was someone choosing to move forward, with gratitude for the one who believed in me from the beginning, and with forgiveness, limited but real, for those who once broke me. The road ahead is still long, but this time, I'm not walking in fear. I'm walking in truth. And on my own 2 feet, about 3 months after the agreement was signed, I received my official acceptance letter into a top-tier digital marketing master's program in the region. It arrived on a gray, overcast afternoon, but the moment I opened it, the entire room seemed to brighten. Not because of the school's name or the fact that my tuition would be fully covered by my grandmother's trust, but because I knew I was stepping into a new chapter, one I had the full authority to write for myself. That evening, I sat by the window of my little apartment, opened my laptop, and began sharing my story on a community forum. I didn't write it to assign blame. I wrote it for those who had once felt like me, the ones who were labeled the problem in their own families, who believed that if they just tried a little harder, they would finally be loved. I wrote that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stop trying to be accepted by others and instead begin the journey of accepting yourself, even if it means walking away from the people you once loved most. The responses came faster than I expected. Hundreds of messages from strangers who somehow felt so familiar. They told me their stories about controlling parents, long silences, tense dinners full of expectations, and dreams that had been slowly suffocated. I no longer felt alone. I felt like I was part of something bigger, a generation learning to heal, to set boundaries, and to redefine what family means. I started receiving invitations to speak at small workshops, writing posts for mental health blogs, supporting young people who were struggling with toxic family dynamics. I wasn't a professional. I was just someone who had once been pushed out of the home she grew up in and survived. And now, I was telling that story not with bitterness, but with clarity and calm. One evening, as I stood in front of my first master's class, looking out at dozens of young faces, I realized I had come so far. Not in miles, but in strength. My grandmother once told me that true freedom begins within. And now, I understood that more clearly than ever before. And then, the ending came, not like a final bell, but like a door gently opening to let a new journey begin. 6 months after everything unraveled, I visited Grandma Beverly's grave for the first time since the truth came to light. The cemetery was quiet. Golden leaves drifted softly across the gravel path. The cold November wind brushed past my shoulders. I brought with me a bouquet of white tulips, her favorite flower, and a worn copy of the letter she once left for me, neatly folded but now creased from being reread nearly every week. I sat down, placed the flowers by her headstone, and whispered as if she were still there. "You were right. About everything. You saw me when no one else did. You believed in me before I ever believed in myself. And because of you, I don't just have shelter or protection. I have a real life, one I didn't have to trade my soul to earn." In that moment, I didn't feel like she was gone. I felt her alive in me. In every choice I made, in every boundary I set, in every time I said no to control and yes to myself. As I left the cemetery, I felt a strange kind of peace. The anger was gone. The pain quieted. All that remained was gratitude. Gratitude that even through hurt, I could choose to heal. Gratitude that even though I had to leave the place I once called home, I found a real one within myself. If you're watching this video and have ever felt like you weren't enough just because you didn't fit your family's mold, I want you to remember this. You have the right to redraw the map of your own life. No one can lock you out forever, not if you find the key within. Share your story in the comments below. And if my journey touched something inside you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Because the path to finding yourself is never easy. But you don't have to walk it alone. Thank you for listening.
I'm Carly.
And this is my true story, /